My name is Voytek Janisz. I work as an enterprise architect at Progressive Insurance. I suspect most of you might have heard about our company. For those who have not, we are probably best known as one of the leading providers of auto insurance in the United States. And we are a fairly large company, about $17 billion of annual revenue. We have about 27,000 employees. 3,000 of those employees are IT personnel. As you can imagine, a company of this size, change is not easy, and which makes the role of architecture even more important. And that, of course, is based on the premise that the architecture really is this vehicle that drives or guides the change. I always use this analogy because it helps me. It's like architecture is a little bit like a GPS. You get into your car, you acquire the satellites, you need to know where you are first, right? And you punch in your destination, right? And then it kind of guides you, right? But then there's also some settings that you probably have hidden in your setup someplace, which are, well, do you want to avoid toll roads, or do you want to have a shortest route, or do you want to have a quickest route, or do you want a scenic route, do you want to stop along the way? So whether we realize it or not, consciously or subconsciously, we're making all those value choices along the way. And this is very much like that with the architecture. So the architecture value, the architecture value has been on the forefront of discussion in the architecture community for quite some time. I remember I was at the conference, it was a Gartner conference a couple of years ago, and Gartner is like one of the IT research firms, if you don't know. And they made this bold statement that the era of architecture frameworks is over. Now it's all about the business value. Now, I hope that they didn't really completely mean that. I think they still believe that there's a value in the architecture frameworks, or using them or defining them. But I think they want to highlight the fact that we should maybe stop obsessing about this architecture framework all that much and really focus on delivering and documenting the architecture value. Now, the era of framework is over. This is coming from the guy who has an architecture framework in the title. But, well, let's look at, so it's hard, right? So actually doing the value of the architecture is hard. So let's look at this very simple example. A base case, when you have a system and you're basically trying to make no investments in it, and after some time, driven by a period of time and some drivers, we end up in the future state. Now, someone would say, well, if we don't make any architectural investments or no major investments at all, then pretty much the cost-to-benefit curve is going to be flat. Of course, that someone is probably not in this room, because most of you would probably agree that the curve is going to look more like this, which is going to, the cost of benefits is going to increase. Why? Because our systems don't exist in the isolation. They're affected by changing technology. They're affected by other systems. So now let's consider the other case when we have an alternate future state. That future state requires some additional investments on top of this run the business type investment. Perhaps that future state is more suitable for our business needs long term. Now, this curve is less attractive long term, perhaps more attractive long term. Now, this is a typical curve. Somebody will say, well, obviously, if we're implementing something new, we have this initial cost that we need to incur. But keep in mind, we're talking about architecture. We're not really talking about the functionality here. I mean, it's easily understood by the functionality. But if this is architecture, no added visible functionality, just underlying stuff which may or may not benefit us sometime way in the future, right? So what is this value? How do we really assess this value? The difference between the future state when we basically say do nothing and the future state B when we want to invest in the architecture. And there could be additional states, state C or D, right? We also need to recognize the fact that each one of those future states will also become the baseline state from which we'll be marching on in the future. There may be some benefits down the road. So how do you put the value on the flexibility? How do you put the value on being able to change your mind later? So being driven by these challenges, we at Progressive, we set out to do the following. First of all, we wanted to force considerations of options. Whenever we conduct architectural decisions, we wanted to make sure that people actually entertain some options, even if the only options seem to be available that do nothing or do something. We wanted to force that. We wanted to have this framework drive meaningful discussions about hidden costs and benefits of architecture, long and short term. We wanted to recognize that the trade-offs are necessary. We wanted to put this up front so people know we're going to illuminate them so they're not hidden, so they're obvious. And when the architecture decisions are made, it's clear that deciding one way may actually jeopardize jeopardize the architecture in another area. We wanted to be able to express the value consistently whenever the architecture options were considered. And here, the need for us was twofold. One, we wanted to develop a sort of a muscle memory with our architects. We wanted to make sure that they kind of think along those lines, they think about the options, and they really look at certain attributes of architectures all the time. So after a while, they don't need any special instructions. They just do it because they remember that they need to do it. And another reason for consistency here for us was because Progressive, we are a data company, so we like to measure things and then improve things based on real data. So we wanted to record our architecture decisions and our architecture outcomes based on some consistent measures. We wanted to express value in terms that resonate with business. There's been several presentations at this conference that basically stress the value of doing that. Obviously, we wanted to make sure that the business understands what it is, what architecture is. And the last one, we wanted to inform decisions, not force them. And this is kind of different than how other people do it sometimes. And this comes from the recognition that the architecture decisions are not made by the architects. I think one of the previous presentations actually said that how many of you guys actually really make architecture decisions, right? You're not the ones holding the bag of money. Somebody else is. So we wanted to inform those decisions and influence them rather than force them. So out of that need, what we developed is what we call the architecture valuation framework. What it really is a simple taxonomy, a way to categorize value, and it's accompanied with a simple template for filling in the values and visualizing the value, as well as a set of guidance around how to score individual attributes. So we structure the value in 3 dimensions: cost, dealing with, you guessed it, cost; pace, dealing with time aspect of delivery; and the architecture quality, which is probably going to be most familiar to you because this has a relationship there with the quality attributes. Each one of those dimensions has a set number of attributes. So the cost has 3 of them, pace has 2 of them, and the architecture quality has 4 of them. I'll talk about them later on. The outer ring here, which you see, is what we call considerations. Considerations are not scored differently. Those are sort of influencers. So things that you need to think about because those things can potentially affect how you score individual attributes. So I talk about scoring. So each one of those attributes in the middle there is, they are scored individually. They scored on the range of 0 to 4, 0 being the least favorable, 4 being the most favorable. We make no assumption about the relative importance of those attributes. So each one of them stands on its own. Let's see. I think let's look at some of those attributes now. So let's look at the cost dimension. In the cost dimension, we have 3 attributes. First is the implementation cost, which is essentially estimated cost of implementing a complete solution, including capital, labor, and anything that goes into the implementation cycle. And we score it based on certain ranges. Now, those are illustrative. These are not the actual ranges necessarily, but we actually, when we present this thing to the architects, we say, well, score it, look at these ranges. If you need to adjust those ranges, you can. Make those ranges meaningful. But we start with this set of ranges given to us by project management office organization based on the experience with previous projects. The second attribute is the operational cost, which is the estimated cost of running the IT systems once the architecture or the solution is in place. So another financial attribute there. Also here we have ranges initially defined by our project management office and our financial control group. We provide them as a guidance. We encourage people to adjust them if they need to be adjusted to further eliminate differences between the options. And the last one is more abstract. It's savings on future solutions. So this is meant to illustrate the benefit, long-term benefits. So imagine this, we're putting the architecture in place. Once this architecture is in place, are we going to be able to build solutions based on that architecture cheaper in the future? A good example of this is potentially something that, imagine that the project in question is setting up the enterprise service bus or a web API infrastructure, right? So in theory, in the future, when you start building solutions around that architecture, you should be able to deliver solutions cheaper. Here we have we're basically looking at the percentage gain or loss between the options compared to the baseline being the current state. So in other words, if we introduce solution number 1, architecture number 1, is it going to help us in terms of cost of future solution? Pace dimension, it has two attributes, time to benefit. So in other words, how soon can we deliver? How soon can we deliver the system with this architecture that we're proposing? Again, number of ranges. Again, the key supplier of those initial ranges is our project management office. And the second attribute is enabled speed of solutions. So enabled speed of solution is kind of analogous to the last attributes in the cost dimension, is the projected change in speed of delivery of future solutions. So the example with the Enterprise Service Bus or Web API, it kind of works here too. So if you can imagine. And here we have a somewhat subjective rating, obviously, significantly longer, from significantly longer to significantly shorter. So obviously, significantly shorter is better or the most desirable. The last architecture dimension is the architecture quality. In the architecture quality, we have 4 attributes only. Shocker, right? Only 4 attributes. So security, our measure of ability to secure the system based on the architecture being proposed. The other 3 attributes are aggregates. So performance is a cumulative measure of manageability, throughput, latency, flexibility, a measure of maintainability, scalability, reusability, and testability. Availability, we express as a measure of downtime, capacity, utilization, and recoverability. Now, those are, you know those from the quality attribute workshops and all that, right? So we don't have any magical formula that basically people go off and score those individual ones, and then somehow magical formula comes up and kind of spits out the score for flexibility, availability, and performance. No, we're asking people to think about those things, basically consider them, and then in a consensus way come up with the cumulative measure for those attributes. What we found out is that partners that we're dealing with in the architecture space, the decision makers, they don't necessarily care about latency. They don't necessarily care about utilization. Really, I mean, they care, but they don't want to hear this, right? They understand performance. They understand flexibility. They understand availability and security. They do. Those are commonly understood terms. So we don't want to bother them. It doesn't mean that we don't want to consider those things. Of course we do. But we want to roll it up to make it more digestible by our partners. So the last one is general considerations. So like I said, those are influencers. We don't score those individually. There are many different considerations, of course, when you evaluate cost or performance or flexibility, availability, what have you. We settle on these 4 initially because we realize that this is what we talk about all the time when we talk about the architecture or good or bad outcomes of the architecture. So for instance, risk. We treat risk as a general uncertainty. And just saying, oh, this option is more risky than the other, it's not enough, because you always have to ask, is it risk to implementation costs, or is it risk to the operational costs, or is it risk to performance, or is this to security? So that's why it's one of those cross-cutting type consideration rather than the attribute itself. We have complexity, and when we talk about complexity, we're talking about intra-complexity, so internal complexity of components. Expressed through the interdependencies inside, for instance, number of interfaces. It could be lines of code. However you want to express it. We provide some guidance around this, but we are not fixing it that you must count your lines of code. The number of interfaces is how you derive the complexity. We're just saying think of complexity. It could be this or it could be that, but you need to think about it. There's also something that we call the transitional complexity here. So this is the complexity that we introduce as part of the implementation. In other words, think of it as building a scaffolding. We need to implement something that we need to integrate with the rest of our system. Sometimes you can't do a complete integration. Sometimes you can't do it all at once. So you have to build some scaffolding, add extra complexity initially with a desire to strip it down later. So we have that concept. There's a concept of dependencies. Dependencies we reflect as dependencies between systems, but we also look at it as dependencies between organizations. So why is that important? Of course, your team is larger. You have potentially distributed teams, different managers. So things tend to get more expensive or more complicated. Decisions are not as easy to make. So it's an important factor. And the skills, obviously. Introduction of new skills or skills obsolescence. It could be a positive factor too, so it's not always a cost thing. Maybe some of the skills introduced by one of the architecture options actually bring in-house some skills that are of strategic value to the company. So that's this is essentially the structure of the architecture framework. We don't score those, as I mentioned. Since we wanted this framework to help with communications. We wanted to have this framework to allow meaningful discussions. We felt that it was important to standardize on the way we visualize the results of the evaluation. So here we decided to use a radar chart, or sometimes people call it a spider chart, for those who are not familiar with it. So there's basically a set of spokes, and the length of the spoke corresponds to the magnitude of the value. So in that chart, we plot attributes for a given option as data series. So consider this simple example, non-specific example here, where we have to have a new system. We have to develop a new system or bring in a new system somehow. Option number one, we build it from scratch, in-house. Option number two, we bring in a commercial off-the-shelf product as the basis for our solution. And number three, rent, perhaps it's a software as a service approach. Right? So we plot these things on the chart, and what you can see here, okay, so implementation costs quite predictably. The rent option or the cloud option, probably implementation cost is the best. Operational costs, same. However, look at the flexibility. Flexibility, well, build scored higher than rent or buy. Why? I don't know, maybe because we build it for purpose. So it's more flexible because it fits better with our systems. We're not bound by some limitations of the custom or the commercial product or the SaaS offering. We also have something like enabled speed of solutions. Well, the build is scored the highest. Why? I have no idea, right? And that illustrates one of the limitations, obviously. This chart alone is not going to tell you everything you need to know, right? So for that reason, we're not saying this is the only way you visualize. We also have this whole score rationale. So whenever we use this framework, whenever we apply the framework, wherever we evaluate in each and every attribute, we also require people to provide some rationale behind scoring. So this is the forefront. This is what people see first, is the chart, and it gives them some information. However, if they question something or they want to challenge something, there is also accompanying documentation that comes with it and say, well, how did you come up with this enabled speed of solutions being, better, if we've developed the custom solution in-house? A little bit about using the framework. We wanted this framework to be used pretty much anywhere and everywhere we deal with the architecture decisions. So for that reason, we opted for loose coupling with our processes. What this means is that we don't provide a lot of guidance in terms of process, how to apply the framework. Instead, we rely on the process in context of which this framework is applied. We are a TOGAF shop at Progressive, so we have implemented the entire architecture development methodology as prescribed by the Open Group at Progressive. And part of the ADM, our implementation of the ADM, is what we call target architecture definition. It essentially covers the first 5 phases of TOGAF ADM. Typically, those are the efforts that are larger and more strategic in scope. And they are driven by a very well-defined process. So we start with the vision. We define the vision. We actually put together a vision document. We socialize it with the stakeholders, make sure that we are doing things for the right reasons. We have it approved. Then we move on. We develop the ADD document. For those of you who are not familiar with TOGAF, this is like one of the key deliverables of the TOGAF ADM. This is where we basically describe this architecture, target architecture. As part of that development, as part of that ADD, production of that ADD document that describes your target architecture, we are mandating the use of the architecture evaluation framework. So this is very important to us because people are really looking at something very strategic, something that have impact across the whole enterprise. Like I said, the target architecture definitions are usually done in context of a business unit or the entire enterprise. The output of it, of course, goes into the architecture approval, the Enterprise Architecture Review Board for approval, and then it's also approved by our business leaders. So it's a fundamental piece of information that is used in the target architecture setting. And we rely on a lot of collateral that we collected over the years here at Progressive in doing that. So some artifacts as well as the teams. Teams are in blue, artifacts are in orange. There's a few things to be said about building the framework. So first, there are methodologies out there, of course. This is SEI conference, so there's ATAM, CBAM, SACAM, right? Of course, we know that. Why didn't you guys adopt this? Just right? Well, those methodologies, as you know, they are full-blown methodologies. We're not calling ours methodologies. We call it our framework, for lack of a better name. But you also notice this is actually, this presentation is part of the leadership and business track, not methodologies track. I don't know if you guys noticed that. So anyway, so those methodologies have elaborate, sort of somewhat elaborate process associated with them, and those methodologies also give a lot of attention to identifying of those attributes. What we want, they're also very software-centric. What we wanted to do, we wanted to, a couple of things. So we wanted to make sure that we can actually use this framework in contexts that are not so software-centric. We wanted to be able to apply this framework in situations where we have solutions or projects that are more process-oriented. We also wanted to apply this framework in situations that are more hardware-oriented, so the data center type work, so less software. We also wanted to make sure that, that we have a set number of attributes that we're dealing with, because like I said, Progressive, we're a data company. We wanted to be able to track our architecture decisions and use that information down the road to improve the framework and to make sure that we provide the adequate training, that we kind of really have a track of what architecture decisions were successful and what they were based on. So that's why we decided to kind of go it our way. But like I said in the previous slide, in those larger initiatives, we're saying we're encouraging people to use the quality architecture workshop, whatever works, really to get you to the scoring of the attributes. So we're not saying don't use it. We're saying no, by all means, use it. But we're recognizing the fact that sometimes it just doesn't scale down very well. So we wanted to decouple it from the specific methodology. So since we wanted to have a fixed set of attributes, we didn't just come up with them out of the blue. You notice that we rolled them up. So what we did, we basically canvassed our previous architecture decisions. We look at the architecture governance logs. This is where we have a record of the architecture solutions being reviewed by the architecture review boards. So we look at what those architecture decisions were being based on. We also looked at the outcomes of the architecture. So here we primarily rely on the interviewing and on the stories by our senior personnel when they were telling us, you know, here's we messed up something with the architecture, now we're reaping the consequences of it. Or the success stories, which is the opposite of that. Look, we did something good in there, now we really can move faster or cheaper. So we use this, and this is also serves as this feedback loop for us to be able to improve the framework and improve overall shape of our architecture practice. And then there's enterprise practices. We wanted to make sure that we reuse as much as possible. I mentioned this briefly in the beginning, that we were using certain things for the project management office or from our financial control group. So we do have, obviously, estimation practices, risk analysis practices, or project scoping practices. We try to bake that into our guidance. We're telling people, well, as you're considering values, you're scoring those attributes, use those things. And we're doing this for two reasons. Essentially, one, it helps us with buy-in, because the other parts of the organization, not just EA, but the other parts of the organization, all of a sudden look at this whole valuation framework in a different light because we're using their methodology. So they feel included, and they feel that we are compatible with their measures and the way they look at things. Very important. So it's the buy-in, but it also increases our accuracy. We're using the same estimation techniques, the same risk analysis techniques. So at least in the eyes of the business, we are increasing the accuracy of the estimates. The requirements, I talked about the requirements. That was the second slide. And so you know what those are. But the scope of interest is also interesting. We had to balance the scope of interest of different stakeholder groups. So a good example of this, obviously, the project team is probably going to be more interested in the implementation cost or time to benefit, right? Probably the service management organization or the business unit managers, they are probably going to be more interested in long-term benefit. Are they going to be able to maintain it? Are they going to be able to scale it up or modify it easily down the road? So we had to come up with the balance of those attributes that kind of addresses all those different concerns. And the last one is culture. I mentioned a couple of aspects of it, but we like to move fast at Progressive. So the reason why we scale down, and we were very, very adamant about having this framework's ability to scale down, was that any perception of something that is a tax on the delivery time is just not good, right? So we wanted to decouple this from the processes, but at the same time allow inclusion of this framework in any process that it may be included in. Another thing I also mentioned is the data-centric. We are a data-centric organization, so we want to make sure that we have something that we can consistently track and measure and use that for future improvements. So key takeaways, as a wrap-up. I don't know if we have time. Good. So again, the architecture framework developed by Progressive is really used to articulate architecture options, categorize architecture values, and use as a communication mechanism. Some of the things that work for us may work for you too. Things that are somewhat unique about this is that we frame recommendations as choices rather than imperatives. So we are extending the circle of our stakeholders, extending the circle of our decision makers beyond just the architecture community with that. We use those recommendations to influence the decisions. So we're not trying to push them. We're not upset when we get shot down. But we use those to influence decisions. We use this by showing the trade-offs. So at least when the decision makers make those decisions, they know what they're giving up. We are trying to visualize it in a way that resonates, something that is instantly catching. In fact, we have our business partners demanding to see the radar chart now, the architecture radar chart on those bigger initiatives. So it's really catching on. So this is very good because they want to talk to us, which is not always the case, as you may imagine. We surveyed our past experiences to define a set of key attributes. If you do that, you may find out that some of those attributes are more important than others. We ended up with 9 attributes. 4 of them are what we call the architecture attributes, but remember, those are the roll-up of really 12 architecture attributes. Okay? Reuse existing assessment mechanisms to feed the scoring, and use this for continuous improvement. And probably the last one, keep it simple. This is, after all, about business value and not the framework itself. KISS principle. Thank you.
Okay, so I think that ran a little long. I think we could do one question maybe, and otherwise you can talk to him afterwards. Yes?
In this case, actually, after rolling out this framework, so have you done any kind of post-mortem analysis, like after implementation? You have done after evaluating the architecture, then you have done the implementation. Have you gone back to that evaluation? So was it reflected? Well,
so this is ongoing. This is a great question, but this is ongoing. So we started using architecture evaluation framework during the target architecture definition. So target architecture definitions are by definition long-term, right? So we have implemented this about 1.5 years ago. So we are looking how those architecture attributes are being looked at during implementation cycles that drive us towards this target architecture. But I think it's too soon to have a one comprehensive look back and say, yeah, this totally worked or not. But what we're hearing from people is we're hearing that this drives fantastic discussions on architecture. And we're hearing this from business, which is unheard of before. So before it was just basically the architects talking to each other in the room. Now we're having business talk to us as a result of this. So this is like immediate benefits. We're hoping to get more benefits out of it.
Okay, thank you, Voytek.
Thank you.